Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, where we're covering the Space Security Conference. And we have with us Scott Pace, who is the director of the Space Policy Institute at my alma mater, George Washington University. Sir, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and congratulations for being an alumni.
Yes, exactly. I missed my reunion, I must say, unfortunately, because I was working. But thanks very much for taking time with us. You know, you look at all space trends, whether on the military side, on the commercial side, and we're in sort of a revolution, a period of enormous growth, both on the commercial side, where the business dynamics are changing. You know, if you went 10 years ago, everybody was saying, it's all about cable, and space is sort of an afterthought. On the military side, the United States had a lot of overmatch capability, but we've seen that U.S. strategic advantage diminishing steadily, and obviously then a lot more threatening things that have been happening that are driving it. Talk to us kind of in a holistic way, on the military side and on the commercial side, how the whole space game is changing. And I want to use that as a preface to sort of build the case on how does the new administration need to think about space, both on military and on commercial side.
Well, that's a great question. The things that have changed have been market changes, and there's been policy changes. The market changes have been that there's new demand in the market, mostly coming from information-based systems such as geolocation and location-based services, so the Googles and Facebooks who all want more geolocation. So there's been a growth not only in demand for high-resolution remote sensing, but also having that combined with GPS data. So geospatial data and infrastructure has been a source of new commercial demand, and that's, of course, driving new constellations. On the government side, you're correct that we've, of course, have not had to deal with a peer competitor in space for things like Iraq and Afghanistan. But what's happened in the last several years, particularly since the Chinese ASAT test in 2007, is an increasing number of tests of counter space capabilities by Russia and China, which call into question whether or not space can remain a sanctuary. And I think the answer that people have come to is that it can't. It will not remain a sanctuary, or at least we can't assume that. So there's been much more interest on defense in space, resilience of space systems. And so that combination of a more threatening space environment combined with growth of information-based technologies is driving a lot of rethinking across the space community.
Tell us what, from a policy perspective, the new administration, what are the issues it has to deal with, and what are some recommendations from your part on how they should rule on those issues?
Well, I think one of the major issues they should be thinking about is how do we integrate all these different aspects of U.S. national power? I mean, one of the things that I was critical of in the past administration, even though they were supportive of some space issues, is that they treated them pretty much in separate silos. So if I look at our military objectives in space or diplomatic objectives in space, I need to have a commercial and civil program that can entice other people to want to work with us. So in the past administration talked a lot about going to Mars. That was really hard for other countries to participate in fully. And so if they couldn't participate with us, they weren't really incentivized to want to cooperate with us on other topics. So leadership in the 1960s was about what we could do by ourselves. Leadership today is what can we get other people to want to do with us. And so if we think about our diplomatic interest in space, getting people to kind of go along with rules of the road that we set up, if we want to think about commercial cooperation and partnerships, if we want to think about civil space exploration, we need to have programs for, I believe, returning to the moon as the next step, with Mars as still a goal in the distance, but we have to have ways for people to participate more realistically in near-term projects.
You mentioned a multinational approach, for example, going to the moon, and I want to ask you about that as a giant moon baby, if you will. Some of my earliest memories were of Apollo 8 and of Apollo 11 and 12 and so on. But I wanted to ask, does an America First approach, which the president has articulated, and he believes passionately in it, and he's making the case that that's going to be good for the United States and good for U.S. jobs, but does an approach like that potentially hamstring or complicate an effort, for example, to attract allies to participate, for example, in a big noble endeavor, for example, like a moon program or a Mars effort?
I don't think so. And because America First doesn't mean America alone. That is, America First means looking at what is in our larger national interest, and I think having partners and bringing people to us is part of that interest. I think when you talk about America First, the distinction I make is the idea that we should subordinate our national interest to some larger multinational organization, whether it's a UN committee, whether it's some larger multilateral structure. It doesn't mean the U.S. doesn't make deals, and doesn't mean that we don't find partners. It doesn't mean we have to go alone. It simply means that we look for our own enlightened self-interest. And I think for potential partners, that's actually in some ways good. Because if we want to have a sustainable program, one that's going to last across multiple administrations, then it has to be something that's tied to enduring U.S. national interests. It can't be simply a fancy of the moment or, a soundbite of the moment. And paying attention to fundamental U.S. interests like shaping the space environment, making sure that the rules in space are in our interest. Those are things that are going to last far beyond any particular administration. So taking an America First strategy, I know it sounds grating to some international ears, but I think an America First strategy that means the U.S. is a predictable partner for the long term, I think that would be very attractive.
Talk to us about a moon program. Why is it important for the United States and its allies, or potentially non-allies, go back to the moon?
Well, I think one of the first things to think about is that we haven't been beyond low Earth orbit since 1972. So whenever someone says, well, we've been to the moon already, my usual response is, well, maybe your grandfather went to the moon, but you did not go to the moon. So you need to organize, train, and equip a new generation of organizations and people and interests who are able to do something we once were able to do, we can't do today. And we need to rebuild that capability and learn how to become deep exploration voyagers once again. And in doing that today, we have new technologies, we have new partners, we have experiences from the space station program. We have something which I think I should point out is really valuable from the space station. It's not any particular technology, but the fact that we have thousands and thousands of relationships, trusted, deep relationships with other countries around the world that have come out of that program. And that will be the foundation for deep exploration beyond that. If we pick a goal that's too far in the near term, such as I believe humans, landing on Mars, then those people won't be able to come with us. And I think if we want to go for a long-distance voyage, we need to bring along as many people as we can. That means building on our space station partners. That means picking a goal that we can all train together on, and so we can all voyage together.
As a fan of the space program and a student of space history, and particularly of that era, and particularly the moon program, I think that people, perhaps unless they lived it or have really studied it, don't realize exactly what a massive program that was. What are some of the things that still, as a space historian and policy official, stun you about that age? And what are some of the lessons from that era that are directly applicable to doing any large-scale endeavor today?
I think one of the things that, and this is a very Washingtonian type of view of it, I think one of the things that's really stunning is not particularly just the courage or the audacity, but the fact that we made the acquisition programs work as rapidly as we did. I mean, things were done very, very quickly. We put in place a lot of money simultaneously to buy time in order to meet Kennedy's goal of doing it within a decade. But we made decisions very rapidly. We did testing very rapidly. Every flight was a test flight that we learned something from. And so I think people forget that it was a quasi-wartime environment, that we took risks that I think would be hard to take today. Lacking the context of a Cold War. We made decisions very quickly, which I believe we could still do again. But it highlights how bureaucracies kind of grow over time if they're not exercised. And so I think the most astonishing thing, if you look in the 1960s, is how well the industry and government partnership performed. Made lots of mistakes, but it performed very, very impressively, and we can do so again.
But they spent an enormous amount of money to achieve it.
They did, but they did it in a very short period of time, and then it declined. Now, on one hand, funding for the space program, civil space program, peaked at a little over 1% of the GDP in fiscal year 1964. You can't imagine spending 1% of the GDP ever again, and it won't ever happen again. But that wasn't simply a reflection of enthusiasm. That was a reflection of the schedule, that you were buying time by putting things together. Now, if you don't do that, if you don't ramp up money quickly and put together a lot of stuff simultaneously, then your schedule's going to slip. And so people ask, why does it take so long to do something that we did in 10 years? It's because we're not willing to put the money up front, make those decisions, make those commitments. So money, time, schedule, all these things can shift back and forth depending on, what the political impetus is. I think we're in a journey. We're not in a race anymore. And again, in that journey, I think we should be bringing other partners along with us.
How soon before the moon? Is it there, back, or a permanent base? And then how soon before we're on Mars?
I think part of what we're doing with exploration is we're trying to figure out what we're capable of doing. So when I ask the rather sometimes academic question of, does humans have a future in space? Do they have a future? And some people, of course, have an answer already. They have faith that we do have a future. Other people are saying, well, we don't know. And it depends on whether we can live off the land, use local resources, and can we do anything up there economically? It pays our own way, or are we always dependent upon the taxpayer nickel? If the answer is we're always dependent upon the taxpayer nickel, but we can use local resources, then space is some form of Antarctica. Maybe there's tourists and a research station, no penguins, but that is someplace that is dependent upon taxpayer support. If we can find something that's useful to do, and we can live off the land, then we have space settlements. We have that science fiction vision. And so the question is, what is the human future in space going to be? And exploration is really about finding that out. We don't know the answer. But if there is going to be a human future in space, then my view is I would want the United States to be part of that. I would want the values of the United States, liberal democracy, a tolerant culture, pluralistic economy. I would want that to be part of that future. And so really deciding what future humans have in space is what exploration is all about, and determining what values will be on that frontier is what exploration is about.
And realistically, the date-wise, how soon before we're on the moon? Because obviously China is working on a program. India has talked about it. How long before man is back on the moon? And realistically, how long after that before man is on Mars?
Well, I believe what's technically possible and what's politically possible are two different things. I think that it's certainly technically and possibly even politically possible to imagine humans' international return to the moon in the mid-2020s. I think the goal of having humans in orbit around Mars in the mid-30s is also possible, but I think humans on the Martian surface is farther out from that. Mars is a much more technically difficult planet. The number of people who can share that with us are farther out. So I believe humans in orbit around Mars is certainly possible by the 2030s. I'm not so sure about humans on the surface, but I am sure that humans on the moon can be done in the mid-2020s.
An important question. Favorite science fiction movie?
Oh, well, 2001, of course. And the answer is not for the somewhat obscure ending that Stanley Kubrick gave it, but for the fact that it showed a human future in space that had international and commercial partnerships, had companies in space, had people living and working in space, had people doing science. It was space really as a normal part of human activity, not as a space opera or fantasy environment, but as a place where we work and live.
And Pan Am was selling tickets as well.
And there was the Bell phone system was providing service aboard the space station, and there was a Hilton.
And Star Wars or Star Trek?
Oh, Star Trek.
Original series?
That's tough. I'm actually one of those people who prefer Deep Space Nine, but I realize I'm a minority.
I'm an original series. Yes, Jen thinks that's great. I'm an original series guy, and of course William Shatner, 86 years old now, so Captain Kirk goes strong.
Do you ever notice in the original series that there's no money in the original series, but they still have lawyers?
That is a deep philosophical question.
Whereas in Deep Space Nine, they have both money and lawyers. So I think it's more realistic.
Sir, thanks very much, and go Colonials.
Go Colonials. Thank you.